Hi, my name is Eamon Engber, and today I'm going to be speaking about prescribed fire in second growth redwoods and Oak Woodlands at Redwood National Park. I'm the fire ecologist at Redwood National Park and a couple other parks in Northern California and Southern Oregon. And I also worked with Phil Van Mantgum with USGS Arcata and Jason Taraoka, our forester at Redwood National Park, on some of the components of this presentation. So just to give you a little context for Redwood National Park, if you're not familiar with where it is, we're in Northern California, Northwestern California on the coast, and the park was established in 1968 to protect the remaining old-growth redwoods that had not been logged. In 1978, the park was expanded to include the upper Redwood Creek watershed, and this added about 48,000 acres and brought the total for Redwood National and State Parks up to about 133,000 acres. About 45% of the park's redwood forest is second growth that was previously logged. So in this image in the background, you can see this was a recent logged landscape on the right side of the screen. And so in that 1978 expansion, that was really the beginning of the forest restoration planning, because the park took on and assumed a vast acreage of second growth forest that needed to be restored. This is a map of the vegetation communities in the park, and we have the Redwood Creek drainage down on the southern side, and Prairie Creek on the north. The dark green is remaining intact old growth redwood forests, and the light green is the logged second growth coniferous forest. In the southeastern corner of the park, we have an area known as the Bald Hills, which is Oregon white oak woodlands and some black oak woodlands intermixed with grasslands on ridgetops, and that's around 4,500 acres. In both of these vegetation types, both the second growth redwoods and the oak woodland Bald Hills, we manage those with fire and other methods. So as far as some of the problems and objectives for our second growth management program, these stands are obviously not old growth, and they don't share many of the old growth characteristics that the park promotes. And so some of the issues in these even-aged second growth stands are that they're dense, they're simple canopy structured, there's a lot of competition, so the vigor is low. They're also dominated by Douglas-fir. So these are areas, some of which were aerially seeded post-harvest, and Douglas-fir also just came in naturally and outcompeted redwood in certain areas. There's very little understory development in terms of herbaceous plants, shrubs, low biodiversity, and they're also vulnerable to disturbances, especially fire, because there's heavy ladder fuels. There's also numerous stumps and sticks on the ground. The stands are going through density-dependent mortality, so they're recruiting more fuels over time. So they're in need of management to improve the habitat quality, as well as lower the vulnerability to disturbance. In our oak woodlands at Redwood National Park, they're, like I said before, they're white oak woodlands, and these are in a landscape that is generally dominated by coniferous forests, so they're relatively infrequent on the landscape. And they provide a suite of valuable wildlife and biodiversity habitat values that the surrounding coniferous forests do not. If you're familiar with oak woodlands in California, there's a number of issues that are commonly discussed, and those are listed below. But one of the bigger issues for us at Redwood, as well as other areas in the Pacific Northwest managing white oak woodlands, is the removal of fire and the associated changes in vegetation, and particularly conifer encroachment following that removal of fire. This is a picture of Douglas-fir encroachment into an oak woodland that's a mix of California black oak and Oregon white oak that was burned 10 years prior to this picture. So like I mentioned before, these woodland ecosystems are often adjacent to the coniferous forest. And so the seed sources are there. And so we have to burn these woodlands on around a 3 to 5 year interval continually to maintain the open nature of these stands. And so Douglas-fir rapidly seeds in, and we've seen generally encroachment around about 250 feet out from the adjacent conifer forest or from patches of older encroachment. Continuing with this Oak Woodland portion of the talk, as far as where we use fire and where we have success using fire, we tend to have success in terms of management of fire in the establishment period in terms of young conifers coming into these stands. So this diagram kind of shows a conceptual model for the establishment and overtopping and development of Douglas-fir in these stands in the absence of fire. So using prescribed fire in these unencroached stands or early establishment stands can be pretty effective. Once you move into these later stages of encroachment, piercing and overtopping, it's hard to use fire to meet objectives of conifer mortality because it's hard to burn that hot and also keep your fire in the box, so to speak. And you also want to limit mortality in the mature oaks in the stand. So we tend to use fire in these early establishment phases, and then we utilize mechanical methods, chainsaws, in the later stages of encroachment. So just an example of that, we might do a phase 1 restoration where we do thinning and pile burning on the edge of this encroached area. You can see these large Douglas firs and then white oaks scattered back beneath the Douglas-fir canopy. That's generally not an area we would just broadcast burn as a first entry. You got to use a mechanical treatment to make that that first entry and push that coniferous forest back. After that, we might use prescribed fire to maintain those areas that were mechanically treated. Again, on that 3 to 5 year interval, reburning. We tend to have good success with these smaller saplings. So typically trees that may be under 10 feet tall. There's a couple photos here, photo points from left to right, pre and post burn. And you can see fairly effective conifer mortality in that oak woodland understory. And you can see the person in there for scale. One thing to be aware of when burning oak woodlands to manage conifers and maintain the oaks is that young white oaks are also susceptible to mortality. They tend to be easily top killed, but they do resprout. So you don't often eliminate them from the site, but you will top kill them and essentially start them from ground zero again. So we've seen up to about 90% top kill for oaks in that 3 meter or 10 foot size class. Most of those will resprout, and we've seen up to about 3 feet approximately of growth in the first season after the fire. I want to point you to a more detailed presentation I've given for UC Cooperative Extension on prescribed fire for conifer management in Oak Woodlands. The link is posted here, so I'm not going to speak to Oak Woodlands anymore in this presentation, but feel free to check this other presentation out because it's got a little bit more detail on that topic. So now I'm going to be speaking about second growth management with prescribed fire at Redwood National Park. And to provide a little more context, I just want to highlight some of our forest restoration objectives again. So the first of those is to decrease stand density, to increase spatial heterogeneity in the forest canopy, to alter that species composition and to give redwood a competitive advantage in those stands where Douglas-fir is more prevalent than it was historically. Also to increase understory diversity, so to create some gaps in the canopy and allow some light to reach that understory, and to generally increase the vigor and make those forests less susceptible to environmental stressors. So we have a forest restoration program at Redwood National Park that uses the tools of standard industrial forestry. I'm not going to be speaking about that today, but we're also utilizing prescribed fire to manage some of these areas. So prescribed fire as a treatment has some utility in low accessibility stands that are maybe challenging or impossible to get equipment to. And prescribed fire also may have some novel treatment effects. So for example, understory and surface fuel reduction by consuming those fuels. There may be a different understory vegetation response from burning due to that fuel consumption and dust and litter fuel consumption, as well as changes in the chemical composition of the soil, snag and cavity creation, nutrient cycling, and potentially more or at least different spatial heterogeneity with a prescribed fire versus a mechanical thinning. There also may be some economical benefit for stands with small trees and pre-commercial size classes. So I'm going to be talking about one burn unit today. We've done a few different burns in second growth forests over the past decade at Redwood, but today we're going to be talking about this lower airstrip expansion burn unit. It's about 50 acres and it's in the Bald Hills area. It's kind of a upper slope redwood, mixed redwood and Douglas-fir stand. So we burned this stand for the first time in 2013, and it was a very cool low intensity burn in the fall of 2013. And then we burned it again in 2018, and that was more of a moderate to high intensity burn. So this is a nice example to look at two different burns. So in that first prescribed fire treatment, it was low intensity, like I said, and what we found was that areas dominated by redwood within the stand burned pretty well. The redwood litter is fluffy and flammable as a fuel bed, and it carried fire pretty well under relatively cool conditions. What we also found was that those areas that didn't have redwood and that were dominated by Doug fir and tan oak barely carried fire at all. And so the conditions that we had leading up to that burn, we had pretty full relative humidity recovery in the evenings prior to the burn. There was fog inundation on the burn unit. And then on the burn day, it was a clear day, but we had humidities between 40 and 50%, temperatures between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. We had 10-hour fuel sticks, which are half-inch ponderosa pine dowels. Those are pretty high fuel moisture content at 15 to 20%. And we also had minimal wind at the surface, so almost no wind in that 2013 burn. And here's just a couple pictures of that burn. You can see it was very patchy. It carried around the redwoods and held up on drainages and damp areas and areas that lacked that redwood leaf litter. Our 2018 burn in the lower airstrip unit was a more moderate to high intensity burn. I was able to request a burn severity image from the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity program. And you can see these areas that are kind of light blue are low intensity, minimal overstory mortality, moderate intensity is yellow, and high intensity is red. So we had a few acres of actual high intensity, and that was areas where we blasted holes in the canopy and pretty complete overstory mortality in those high intensity spots or high severity spots. So what we found during the second burn was that we had more complete fire spread in all the fuel types, regardless of species. It was also a late October burn, but we had an offshore flow weather pattern in the preceding days leading up to that burn. So there were much drier conditions and much less fog. Humidity recovery was much lower. We had humidities in the teens in the days leading up to that burn. And then on burn day, we had a relative humidity of 35 to 50% throughout the burn. Temperatures were again in the mid 50s. And 10-hour fuels, those half-inch ponderosa pine dowels that we set out, were at 9% versus 15 to 20 for the 2013 burn. So much drier. Winds are about 5 to 8 miles per hour out in the open grass, but still light beneath the canopy due to that canopy effect, 1 to 2 miles per hour in the forest understory. First, I'll discuss the fuel consumption patterns from these burns. So the blue is pre-burn, the orange is after the first burn, and the gray is after the second burn. So if we just look at overall fuel loading, we're down about 23% from the pre-burn condition after 2 burns. If we look at just the fine fuels, which are a primary driver of fire behavior, they're down about 39%. And so you can see that here in this 1 to 3 inch, that's a 1 to 3 inch size class, so 1s, 10s, and 100-hour fuels. If we look at 1,000-hour fuels, we break those into sound 1,000 hours and rotten 1,000 hours. So those are logs that are 3 inches diameter and above. And so what we found was we actually had an increase in the sound 1,000-hour fuels by about 600%. That is recruitment of trees in the canopy that we killed in that second burn. So small Douglas-fir and tan oak that came down and hit the ground, some small redwoods, and those have recruited to the fuel bed and they're still sound. If we look at rotten 1,000-hour fuels, those are almost eliminated following that second burn, which was much hotter. So it consumed much of the 1,000-hour rotten size classes. But again, overall, around a 23% reduction in fuel loading. Litter and dust was reduced substantially after the first burn and pretty much stayed the same after the second burn. Dust, however, was reduced even further than litter, and so pre-burn, we had under an inch of duff, but somewhere around 0.8 inches. After the first burn, it was reduced by about half, and then after that second burn, we were running around 1/10 of an inch of duff, and that was pretty consistent across 9 plots that we had in this burn unit. So pretty significant duff reduction. Just to give you an idea of the photos and the kind of the time sequence here, in the upper left, this is one of our plots. This is a pre-burn image of a redwood clump, some Douglas-fir and some tan oaks back in there. Moving to the right, this was after the first burn. So 1 year after that first burn, you can see the char on the boles, somewhat fuel reduction in the understory, but definitely some sticks still there. 5 years after the first burn, down on the lower left, and you can see a tan oak or perhaps a bay that's fallen onto the plot, some logs that have recruited, and so those are larger fuels that were likely killed in that first fire. If you look at the last sequence here on the lower right, that's the 1 year after the second burn, and you can see we consumed a lot of those fuels that were leaning over at year 5, but we also recruited some new fuels. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic where you're both consuming and recruiting fuels. And the take home here is that it's going to take 2 to 3 burns to reach some kind of equilibrium. And if you're working in a dense stand and you do a hot burn, you're definitely going to be recruiting some 1,000-hour fuels over time. But hopefully it'll equalize at some point. And I'm thinking 3 burns for us in this unit. It should begin to calibrate, and we're not going to see the big pulse that we saw. Here's just one more photo sequence. So the upper left, you can see this log in pretty dense stand conditions. This was around one of those redwood clumps, so it burned well even in that first burn. You can see pretty significant fuel consumption. That big log is substantially reduced. The stump is reduced a bit. 5 years after, we've recruited some more material. So you can see some new young tan oaks on the ground that were killed in that first fire. And then we look at 1 year after that second burn, and it's pretty clean in there, but I guarantee you we're going to see some more recruitment of heavy fuels as some of those trees in the canopy come down that were killed in that fire. So hopefully by the third burn entry, we'll reach more of a steady state. Just to summarize some of the changes in the stand diameter distribution over time following these burns, we barely affected trees larger than 8 inches diameter in that first cool season burn, so pretty low percentage mortality for redwood and other species in that burn. The second burn was a different story. We actually reduced the stand density by about 42%, from 216 down to 125 trees per acre. And we saw about a 36% basal area loss for redwood, a 41% basal area loss for Douglas-fir, and a 55% basal area loss for tan oak. So the second burn, we definitely got closer to meeting our objectives, blowing some holes in the canopy, and seeing a higher rate of mortality for Douglas-fir. This graph shows the diameter distribution for dead trees following that second burn. And I'll say that this is preliminary data that's subject to revision. This is from 2 large plots that the USGS installed in this burn unit for us. And you can see most of the mortality is in the Douglas-fir in that 8 to 16 inch or 20 to 40 centimeter diameter class. We killed quite a few trees in that diameter class, which was what we were shooting for. If we look at smaller trees, so trees less than 20 centimeters or less than 8 inches diameter, pretty dense conditions pre-burn. So we had about 382 trees per acre pre-burn. After 2 burns, that went down to 53 trees per acre. And so that's a total of about an 86% reduction in the density of those small trees. And just to note, after that first burn, we only saw about a 33% reduction in density since it was much cooler. If we look at the effects on the various species, we had about a 76% reduction in the redwood density, about a 93% reduction for Douglas-fir, and an 82% reduction in tan oak density. So pretty significant changes in those smaller size classes, and those are those ladder fuels and dense, generally trees that are sub-canopy and don't have a lot of vigor. So it met objectives in this stand as far as reducing those size classes of trees. One thing we're paying attention to with utilizing fire in these stands are these bear damaged redwoods and Douglas-fir, but here's an example of a redwood. Just burning this stand anecdotally, I observed a few trees that consumed some of that dead wood. And so this is something that we're going to analyze further. I think we have some data on this, but we haven't summarized it yet. But it's a consideration if you're using fire in these stands and you have bare damaged trees. Those things are likely going to be more susceptible to igniting and potential stem failure. To talk about understory initiation, especially on the redwoods, we saw a very positive sprouting response from redwoods throughout the stand. Most of the redwoods that burned resprouted at the base, and they also resprouted from the canopy in areas that torched. So that was pretty impressive because we killed adjacent Douglas-fir, and then redwoods were able to capture some of that growing space. What was also pretty interesting was looking at the seedling regeneration. So we had resprouts, but after the second burn that was hotter and consumed a lot of that depth, we saw a significant redwood seedling pulse. And so you can see a little redwood cone here and a seedling coming out of it. But around these redwood clusters, there was a lot of seedling regeneration, which we don't typically see. Just to give you an idea of the seedling distribution, upper left is pre-burn. It was mostly tan oak, California bay, and no redwoods or Douglas-fir. After that first burn, we picked up a few Douglas-fir, and we still had the hardwoods. After the second hot burn, we had a significant change in that seedling distribution. We had 20,000 trees per hectare on average of redwood after that second burn, and we also had a few Douglas-fir. So pretty significant change in that seedling composition following these burns, but especially the hot burn. What we also found was that redwoods were favored in these high severity patches, and I mentioned that before, but here's a couple pictures illuminating that. So these are those high severity patches in that second burn. So these areas were up to about an acre, and there was 100% crown scorch on these trees. And you can see the Douglas-fir in the canopy they're completely dead. There's no green on those canopies, and the redwoods have resprout 1 year later. So we're very interested in looking at growth rates over time and how the redwoods may capture growing space in these areas that burn hot. They seem to be able to tolerate a high level up to almost 100% crown scorch in some cases. So that's pretty impressive because it gives them an advantage over the competitors of Douglas-fir. So I want to summarize some of the burning conditions as far as your weather prescription that I've seen to be beneficial and help us meet objectives in using fire in these second growth stands. So the first thing is dry conditions in the week prior to the burn. So little to no rainfall, minimal fog sitting on your burn unit. Offshore flow is definitely helpful. It's a fine line there, though. If it's too hot and dry and windy, you're going to be out of prescription, obviously. But those are the conditions that dry out these coastal redwood forests and bring them into prescription. A relative humidity between 30 and 50% and a temperature around 50 to 75 degrees, that'll generally give you a 10-hour fuel stick moisture between 8 and 12%. And that's generally where you want to be. That's where you'll see fire spread, not just in the redwoods, but also in the tan oak and Douglas-fir. And it'll also lead to a probability of ignition of 30 to 50%. And that's kind of where you want to be for continuous fire spread throughout those fuel beds. I'm going to show a link to another presentation on weather if you're not familiar with all these terms. Winds around 5 miles per hour is beneficial. A lot of these stands for us are dense, and so it's challenging to get much wind under those canopies. But if you get a forecast around 5 to 8, that tends to give you winds under 5 in your stand. But you need to adjust prescriptions based on your local conditions, obviously. So if you have a much higher proportion of redwood, you can probably get by on the cooler end of the prescription because that redwood leaf litter is quite flammable and carries fire well. And it also depends on the dryness of your preceding days. If you're following 100% humidity the night before and fog that was on your unit, you're going to need a pretty dry day to be able to carry it through. Here's a picture of a 10-hour fuel moisture stick that I referred to in the presentation. These are available for purchase on the internet, obviously. And then this is a Kestrel Fire Weather Pro meter. I use these. These actually calculate that fine dead fuel moisture and probability of ignition for you. They're the only ones that I've seen doing that as of 2019 anyway. Here's a link to a weather presentation I gave for UC Cooperative Extension. So this is available on YouTube, and you can look at some of these various devices for monitoring weather. and it'll also give you information on some of the terms I've used here. So just to summarize and conclude, at Redwood National Park, we think fire can be effective at meeting forest restoration objectives, but it's going to be a little less precise than mechanical methods. What we're also observing is that 2 to 3 burn entries may be required to reduce surface fuels and get those fuels into more of a steady state, especially in those dense stands. As you're using fire to thin those stands, you're also going to be recruiting fuel to the fuel bed. Redwoods can tolerate higher intensity fire than Douglas-fir, and they tend to be able to capture growing space through that crown sprouting and basal sprouting. So it's pretty impressive, and I think it has an advantage over Douglas-fir in these dense stands. Fire will also initiate redwood regeneration from sprouts as well as seed, and we don't tend to see a lot of seedlings in these dense stands throughout the redwood range. So that's kind of a novel effect of fire that could be important in terms of the regeneration of this species. So I look forward to getting on the phone and answering questions, and thanks for your time.